The bailiff's voice cut through the sterile courtroom air, a brusque, utilitarian sound that broke the silent tension. "Young men, have a seat." Malik Mack, all of 8 years old, obediently sank into the hard wooden chair beside his mother. He sat up straight, his hands folded neatly in his lap, a small, quiet island in a sea of adult anxiety. He was just a boy, but he understood, on some deeper level, that this was about him. From the raised dais, a figure of uncompromising authority watched them both. Judge Judy, a small woman in a black robe, had a gaze that could strip a witness bare. Her voice, when it came, was brisk and to the point, leaving no room for dramatics. "Ms. Mack, it is your claim that the Herrera's dog bit your 8-year-old son." Sarah Mack, the boy's mother, gripped the arms of her chair. Her posture was ramrod straight, a brittle show of strength meant to mask the tremors running just beneath the surface. She looked directly at the judge. "Yes, ma'am." Her voice was tight, a bowstring pulled taut. She felt the weight of her son's presence beside her, the small body that she had been trying so hard to protect. She was not a litigious person, had never imagined herself in a courtroom like this, but a mother's instinct had brought her here. "On what date did this happen?" the judge pressed on, flipping through the papers on her bench. "February 19th, this year." Across the aisle, the Herreras shifted in their seats. A small family, just the two of them, they looked utterly bewildered by the proceedings. The husband wore a polo shirt with a faded company logo, his hands shoved into his jeans pockets. The wife clutched a leash in her lap, a thin cord attached to a miniature dog wrapped in a blanket, a tiny creature that trembled almost as much as the humans around it. They had come to court to defend their 4 dogs, who they saw as their children. "How long have the two of you been neighbors?" Sarah answered first, her words forming a stark contrast with the Herreras' longer history. "I've lived there almost 2 years. This July will be 2 years." She remembered the day she moved in. She had driven her U-Haul up the quiet suburban street and, eager to start a new life in a house with a yard, she had wanted space for her son to run and play. The first thing she had noticed was the lack of a fence between her property and the one next door. A small detail at the time, but one that would become the central point of contention. The Herreras, in their turn, stated their tenure with a quiet pride that seemed to underscore a kind of ownership over the neighborhood itself. "We've lived there for almost 7 years." 7 years. Their roots ran deep, and their easygoing nature had been shaped by a half-decade of peaceful coexistence. In those 7 years, there had been no trouble. The neighborhood was quiet, the yards were open, and the dogs were simply part of the landscape. They had never considered a fence, never felt the need. The dogs had always been free to roam, and it had never been a problem. "And you have 2 dogs?" The judge's question was more of a casual statement, a way to move the conversation along. Mrs. Herrera spoke up, her voice a little higher than her husband's. She adjusted the blanket over the shivering dog. "I have 4 dogs." The judge's gaze flickered. "4 dogs? What kind of dogs do you have?" A faint flicker of a smile crossed Mrs. Herrera's face, a hint of the dog-loving person she was outside this tense environment. "I have a mutt, and then I have a Chiweenie and 2 Chihuahuas." "A what?" Judge Judy asked, a little disbelievingly. "A mutt. She's a mixture of all sorts. And then a Chiweenie, it's a Chihuahua and a wiener dog." A ripple of low laughter passed through the courtroom spectators. Even the judge's lips twitched. It was a brief moment of levity, a human touch in an otherwise tense proceeding. "Oh my goodness," Judge Judy said, her tone a mix of amusement and genuine curiosity. "That's some combo. I don't think I've ever seen that. And 2 Chihuahuas. So you have small dogs." "Yes," Mrs. Herrera said, her voice softer, a little more confident now that the subject was something she loved so dearly. The small, shivering dog in her lap stirred, its beady eyes darting around the room. The contrast between the two families was as stark as black and white. Sarah Mack had no animals, a deliberate choice born of a cautious and orderly worldview. She believed in keeping a neat house, a well-defined space, a predictable life. She had raised her son to be respectful, to understand boundaries. Her fear of the dogs wasn't a hatred of animals. It was a concern for the unpredictable. When the Herrera's small, yapping pack would bound across the invisible property line, she would call Malik inside. Her son, however, was a different story. Malik had never been afraid of the dogs. He loved animals, all of them. He would watch the little dogs from his window, mesmerized by their chaotic energy. He would mimic their excited yaps, and his mother would sternly remind him, "Malik, stay away from the neighbor's dogs. We don't know them." He'd always obeyed, but his boyish curiosity remained. He saw their miniature size as an invitation, not a threat. The Herrera's perspective was just as valid to them. These weren't vicious monsters. They were companions. They were tiny. They were playful. They were part of the family. The idea that their pack, the Chihuahua, the Mutt, and the Chihuahuas, could be a danger was absurd to them. They were simply being dogs, in a yard that had been theirs for 7 years. The judge turned back to Sarah. "Okay, do you have any animals?" "No, ma'am." Sarah's voice had returned to its original clipped, strained tone. She felt a familiar knot of frustration. To the Herreras, this was about their dog's character. To her, it was about a lack of respect, a lack of boundaries. It was about a bite, a wound, and the fear that followed. The judge looked from Sarah to the boy seated beside her. Malik, a child, the quiet epicenter of a small war between neighbors. "This is your son?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of ownership and protection. The judge let her gaze linger on the boy for a moment. He was just a small figure in a big chair, a boy caught between a loving, cautious mother and a pair of dog-loving neighbors. The air crackled with the unspoken truth that this case wasn't just about a dog bite. It was about two very different ways of life colliding on a suburban street. A life of careful control versus a life of casual freedom, and a small, quiet boy in the middle. Judge Judy looked away from Malik, a silent acknowledgement of his innocence in the matter. She then looked out across the courtroom toward the next witnesses. The small, shivering dog in Mrs. Herrera's lap whimpered softly. "All right, let's hear from the children." The judge's voice, though sharp, was not unkind. It hung in the air, a final declaration before the trial truly began. Malik watched her with wide, unblinking eyes. He had been so still, so small, that he had almost disappeared into the oversized chair. Now the courtroom's attention, which had been on his mother and the Herreras, swiveled and locked on him. He could feel it, a heavy, uncomfortable pressure that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. "Ma'am, does he want a dog?" Judge Judy's question came without warning. Sarah Mack, caught off guard, glanced at her son. Her hand, which had been resting protectively on his shoulder, squeezed gently. She was a mother who spoke the truth, a woman who didn't deal in half-truths or convenient fictions. She knew the truth would be her strongest ally. She looked at the judge and answered with a quiet finality, "He does." The words hung in the air for a moment, a simple admission that revealed the subtle tension within their own family. Malik, for his part, kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the scuffed leather of his shoes. Sarah continued, a faint trace of weariness in her voice. "How many times has he asked you for a dog?" The judge's voice was softer now, almost probing, as if she were trying to get to the heart of the matter. "More than I can count." The answer was immediate, without hesitation. It was a truth every parent knows, the relentless, unending negotiation for a pet. The Herreras, seated on the opposite side of the room, watched this exchange with a mix of confusion and what looked like genuine sympathy. They couldn't understand why a boy so clearly in love with animals wasn't allowed to have one. Their entire existence revolved around the unconditional love of their 4 dogs. "Right," Judge Judy said, a flicker of something close to a smile on her face. "So he likes them. He likes to play with them." "Yes," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. She looked at her son, whose small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of the courtroom's gaze. The judge's next question went to the heart of the Herreras' defense. "And I assume he plays with the Herreras' dogs?" Sarah's answer was firm, a line in the sand. "With their dogs, I don't believe so. Their dogs are rarely out on a leash. I've never really seen them." She was right, of course. Her recollection was based on her own observations from her yard, a guarded, watchful vigilance. She saw them as a pack, as a potential threat. What she didn't see was the subtle longing in her son's eyes every time they came into view. Judge Judy, a master of extracting information, let the words hang in the air for a moment before moving on. She confirmed the obvious. They were immediate next-door neighbors, and there was no fence. She established the time of the incident, approximately 5 o'clock p.m. on February 19th. And then she delivered the final, crucial blow of her opening volley. Sarah Mack didn't witness the incident herself. Correct. The judge turned her head, looking at Malik with a new, more direct intensity. Who did? Sarah answered before her son could, a reflexive need to protect him. Skylar did. She looked back at her husband, who simply nodded in agreement. You were outside, Judge Judy said, her voice now aimed directly at Malik. She was no longer speaking to the parents. She was speaking to the boy. And you were there. You got bit. Malik nodded slowly, his movements small and hesitant. Yes, ma'am. Right? The judge's tone was encouraging. She wanted to hear the story from him, the person who had experienced it. Do you want to come up here and tell me about it? Malik's eyes widened, a flicker of panic. He didn't want to come up there. He wanted to melt into the floor, to be back in the car, to be anywhere but here. The courtroom was too big, the judge's chair too high, and the silence that followed every word was unbearable. Sarah's hand on his shoulder tightened. Tell me your first name. Malik's small voice was barely audible. Malik. Malik, the judge repeated, a soft, warm sound that seemed to envelop him. Malik, do you remember the incident with the Herreras' dogs? Malik's eyes darted to his mother, then to the Herreras, who were watching him with a tense, almost pleading expression. He felt a wave of confusion. He remembered the incident, of course he did, but a strange protective impulse took hold. He didn't want to get the little dogs in trouble. He didn't want to be the one who caused them pain. He remembered the look on the small Chihuahua's face, a terrified, snarling grimace. It hadn't been an attack so much as a panicked reaction. You don't? The judge asked, her voice laced with surprise. Malik's head shook side to side, a silent denial. His voice, when it came, was so small it was almost a breath. No, ma'am. With the little Chihuahua? No. Don't remember? No. The three monosyllabic words were a brick wall, a denial that was both baffling and frustrating. The judge's brow furrowed, her lips thinned. It was clear that Malik was not going to give her anything. Skylar's testimony. The bailiff's next call was to another boy. Skylar, please approach the bench. Skylar, who had been sitting quietly on the bench beside his father, stood with a different kind of hesitation. It wasn't the trembling, fear-filled dread of Malik. It was a more confident, yet equally burdened, reluctance. Skylar was a few years older, a little taller, and had a maturity that seemed to come from being the one who had to recount the facts. He looked at his father, who gave him a brief, encouraging nod, and walked toward the judge's dais. He was a slender boy with a mop of unruly brown hair, and his hands, unlike Malik's, weren't folded in his lap. They were balled into nervous fists at his sides. He was the only true witness to the event, and he felt the weight of that responsibility, like a physical pressure on his chest. Judge Judy's gaze softened just a fraction as she addressed him. Her tone was no longer brisk and sharp, but firm and grounded. This was a grandmother speaking to a grandson, a teacher to a student. Her mission was to get the truth, but not at the expense of a child's dignity. Skylar, I want you to tell me exactly what happened. But before you start, I want you to know one thing. It's very important that you tell the truth. Your parents know the truth. The Herreras know the truth, and I know the truth. So don't be afraid. Just tell me what happened. The words were a powerful release. Skylar's hands unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and a wave of relief washed over him. The judge's words had not been a threat, but an invitation, a solemn promise of a safe space in which to speak. He looked directly at the judge, took a deep breath, and began his story. Malik and I were just playing in the front yard. We were pretending we were astronauts. He paused, looking back at his brother, a faint smile on his lips. We had our helmets on, and we were doing a spacewalk. He remembered the day with perfect clarity. The late afternoon sun was a low, golden orb, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawn. The air was cool, but not cold. the kind of day that was perfect for make-believe. Then the dogs came out. They were all on leashes at first, Skylar continued, his voice picking up a steady rhythm. The mutt, she was on a long leash, and she started running around. It got tangled around Mr. Herrera's arm. He described the chaotic scene. The mutt, a wiry ball of excited energy, yapping as it pulled against its owner, the leash tangling into a tight knot. The Herreras had been caught off guard, trying to manage the four dogs at once. Then the Chihuahua broke loose. The words came out in a rush, a sudden shift in his tone from narrative to the memory of raw panic. He remembered the small, furry missile, a flash of brown and black, yapping with a strange, high-pitched aggression. It wasn't the happy sound of a dog at play. It was a territorial, frantic bark. It started chasing Malik. Skylar's voice dropped to a low, intense whisper, his eyes wide with the memory. He was running, and I yelled at him to stop. But he kept running. He had felt a moment of pure terror, a cold, breathless fear. He saw his little brother, the one he was supposed to protect, being chased by a creature he knew to be harmless. But in that moment, it wasn't harmless. It was a threat. The Chihuahua caught him right between the two houses. It bit him on the leg. It happened so fast. He remembered the sound of his mother's scream as she came outside, the look on Malik's face, the flash of red on his shorts. The courtroom was utterly silent, the only sound the quiet rustle of papers as the judge made a note. The parents on both sides were a still tableau of emotion. Sarah's face was a mask of grief and worry, her hand clenched at her chest. The Herreras, who had been so proud of their dogs, were now pale, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The small, whimpering dog in Mrs. Herrera's lap had stopped shivering. Skylar finished his account, his voice trailing off into the tense silence. He had told the truth, the whole story, without embellishment. He had been a hero, a witness, a boy who had had to bear the responsibility of a moment that had changed everything. He looked at Judge Judy, who returned his gaze with an unreadable expression. Her eyes were a deep, knowing shade of brown. She looked away from the boy, a silent acknowledgement of the bravery it had taken to speak. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for her next move. She looked at the Herreras, then at Sarah and Malik, and finally she spoke. "All right, I'm going to review the video evidence." Judge Judy's words hung in the air, a statement of cold, simple fact. "All right, I'm going to review the video evidence." The atmosphere in the courtroom, already tense, now grew thick with anticipation. The Herreras, who had been so sure of their position, looked at each other with a mixture of confusion and panic. Skylar had spoken the truth, a truth that their own narrative could not contain. Mrs. Herrera clutched the blanket tighter around her tiny, trembling dog. For a moment, it seemed as if the world was holding its breath. Sarah Mack, the boy's mother, was a study in quiet resolve. She had waited for this moment. For her, the grainy, black and white footage was not just evidence. It was a vindication. She walked to the side of the courtroom where a small television monitor sat, waiting. She had known all along that her home surveillance system would capture what she could not. It was a digital witness, and it would not lie. She offered a memory card to the bailiff, who inserted it into the proper port. As the screen flickered to life, the courtroom lights were dimmed, casting the small monitor in an eerie, glowing halo. A shaky, low-resolution view of two adjacent suburban front yards appeared. The unadorned grass, the edge of the porches, the two trash cans near the Max house. It was a mundane scene, a slice of an ordinary day, but the knowledge of what was to come infused it with a palpable dread. The footage was soundless at first, a silent movie of a chaotic moment. Malik's small figure entered the frame, a blur of motion. His arms were pumping, his legs at a frantic blur. He was running not with the joyous abandon of a boy at play, but with a desperate, all-consuming fear. And behind him, not two, but three tiny shadows darted in pursuit. Their small, yapping forms were almost comical in their ferocity, but the terror on Malik's face was anything but. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. The Herreras leaned forward, their disbelief etched on their faces. The video didn't lie, it didn't have a bias, it simply presented the unedited truth. The bodies which Mrs. Herrera had so tenderly described were now tiny predators, a miniature pack driven by an instinct the owners had failed to contain. The video showed the three dogs, the mutt, the Chihuahua, and a Chihuahua, a frantic, yapping mob closing in on the small boy. The camera fixed at the Mac's porch captured the moment perfectly, or almost perfectly. As Skylar had stated in his testimony, the actual bite occurred just off camera. Malik disappeared from view for a split second, and then he re-entered the frame, scrambling, his small body lurching toward the safety of the porch. He made it to the edge of the house, his hand outstretched, his small frame trembling, before the video cut out. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of the truth. There was no more ambiguity, no more conflicting testimonies. There was only the undeniable image of a small boy, terrified and running for his life. Judge Judy looked away from the monitor, her face a mask of stone. She had seen enough. The case, which had once seemed to be about a few small scenes and a minor disagreement, was now about truth and denial, about the unblinking eye of a camera and the inconvenient reality it revealed. Her voice, when she spoke again, was sharper than it had been all morning. It was not a question, but a statement of pure, unadulterated fact. It was a firm, uncompromising hammer that shattered the Herreras' fragile defense. "When I first read your answer," she began, looking directly at the Herreras. Her gaze was as hard as flint. "I was sympathetic with you, but that is not what happened." She was referring to the written defense they had filed, a document that had painted a picture of a neighborhood spat, of a boy who had provoked their innocent dogs. It was a story of a boy who had been teasing them, a boy who had been in the wrong. But the video showed a boy running in pure panic, not with malice. The Herreras shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The husband, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, spoke up. "He was teasing the dogs, ma'am. He was provoking them." His voice was a desperate, grasping attempt to cling to a lie that had already unraveled. Judge Judy did not so much as flinch. She simply stared at him, her eyes unblinking. She was a woman who dealt in facts, and the facts were now undeniable. She wasn't going to let them change the story, not after what she had just seen. She had a keen, almost preternatural ability to recognize a lie, and the Herreras' denial was a blatant one. She leaned forward, her voice low, but with a powerful, unmistakable authority that carried to every corner of the room. "No, that is not what happened. I'm going to tell you what happened. Your son, Skylar, just told me what happened. He said that the mutt got its leash tangled around Mr. Herrera's arm, and when you were trying to untangle it, the Chihuahua got loose." The words were a brutal, public recitation of the truth they had been trying so hard to bury. She was not only refuting their narrative, she was using the words of their own son to do it. The full weight of the truth descended upon the Herreras, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shame. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint whimpering of the tiny dog in Mrs. Herrera's lap. Judge Judy continued, her voice rising slightly with each syllable, a note of controlled anger now in her tone. "The dogs, the three of them, began to chase Malik." She paused, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. "And he got bit. There was no negotiation, no debate, no room for a different story. The video had shown the chase, the fear, and the inevitable conclusion. Skylar's testimony had provided the final, crucial details that the camera had missed. The two together created a tapestry of undeniable truth, and the Herreras' denials were now just whispers in the wind. The judge's gaze swept across the room, taking in the shocked faces of the spectators. She was the one in control, the one who had brought order to chaos and truth to a lie. She had taken two different stories, one of a boy who was afraid of a pack of wolves and another of a boy who loved them, and showed that the truth was somewhere in the middle. Malik may have loved dogs, but that didn't make him immune to fear. It didn't stop a frantic, territorial dog from biting him. And the Herreras' dogs may have been companions, but in a moment of chaos, they became a danger. The tension in the courtroom was a tangible thing, a thick, suffocating air that clung to everyone. Sarah Mack felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been vindicated. She had done the right thing, and she had been believed. The Herreras were a portrait of public humiliation. their faces pale, their eyes cast downward in shame. The tiny dog in Mrs. Herrera's lap let out a soft whine, an innocent sound that only served to highlight the guilt of its owners. Judge Judy, her job of extracting the truth complete, now moved on to the next phase of the trial. Her tone, though still firm, was now laced with a cold professional efficiency. The drama was over. The facts were established. All that was left was the financial reckoning. Okay, so you have medical bills as a result of the bite? Judge Judy's gaze was fixed on the Herreras, who sat in stunned silence after the damning video evidence had been presented. She had done her job of unearthing the truth. Now it was time for the practical consequences. The emotional battle had been won by the Macks, but the financial one had yet to be fought. The judge turned to Sarah Mack. Her voice was firm, but a flicker of a softer emotion, perhaps a hint of empathy for the mother who had been forced to defend her son's story, was visible in her expression. Okay, I'd like to see the medical bills, she said, her voice now back to its familiar, no-nonsense tone. Sarah, who had been sitting with her hands clasped in her lap, let out a slow, deliberate breath. The physical relief of being believed was immense. Now came the next hurdle, the cold, hard numbers that represented the cost of that traumatic afternoon. Yes, ma'am. She rose from her chair and approached the judge's dais, a manila envelope clutched tightly in her hand. The envelope contained the documentation of her son's injury, a stack of papers that represented her frustration, her worry, and the financial burden that had been quietly growing over the past months. She slid the bills across the bench. Judge Judy picked them up and examined them with a practiced eye, her brow furrowed in concentration. The bills were from two different medical facilities, a common reality in a modern healthcare system. One was from the emergency room visit for $383. The other was from a follow-up visit with a specialist for $438. The total, $821, was an almost insignificant sum in the grand scheme of things, but to Sarah Mack, a mother without health insurance, it was a heavy weight. It represented the cost of a day that had changed her son's life, and a cost that the Herreras had refused to bear. Did you present these two bills to the Herreras? The judge asked, looking up from the documents. Sarah's expression hardened. Her fight wasn't just about money, it was about principle. It was about the simple, human expectation that when you cause harm, you take responsibility for it. She looked at the Herreras across the courtroom, who now sat with their shoulders hunched, their faces pale. Their shame was palpable, but their denial still remained. Yes, I did, on two separate occasions, Sarah said. The first time, I taped a note and the bills to their front door. The second time, I taped them to the windshield of their car. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I needed them to see it. The simple act of taping a note to a door or a mailbox, it was the quiet, suburban way of confronting a neighbor. It was an act born of desperation and a desire to avoid a face-to-face confrontation. But it was also a way of saying, this is real. This happened. This is your responsibility. Judge Judy's gaze shifted to the Herreras. Her expression was now a mix of cold disapproval and simmering irritation. Their refusal to pay wasn't just a financial matter, it was a continuation of their denial. A stubborn refusal to accept the reality that had been laid bare by the video and their own son's testimony. And what did they say? She asked, her voice as sharp as glass. Sarah hesitated for a moment, remembering the conversation. The phone call had been difficult. She had called them after a few days of no response, her voice strained but calm. The Herreras had been caught off guard, their polite veneer cracking under the pressure of the bills. Frank said they didn't have any problem paying it, but he wanted proof that the bill was specifically for the dog bite, Sarah said, her voice a blend of lingering frustration and tired disbelief. The words, when she spoke them, were an accurate paraphrase of what he had told her. It was a classic deflection, a clever, if transparent, way of creating an obstacle where there was none. The Herreras' faces were a canvas of defensiveness. They had demanded a bill that read, "for dog bite" on it, a demand that was both absurd and a clear sign that they were stalling. They were stuck in a loop of denial, trying to find a way out of a situation that their own negligence had created. The money was not the issue, but the principle was. They were not going to pay for an injury that they refused to believe their dog had caused. The issue, as Sarah had discovered, was a matter of privacy. The hospital had refused to list the injury as a dog bite due to federal HIPAA laws. The medical bill could only list the diagnostic code for the injury, which in this case was a laceration. To the Herreras, this was a loophole. To Sarah, it was a cruel joke. The hospital couldn't tell them it was a dog bite, and they wouldn't pay without that specific, impossible-to-get proof. Judge Judy, a woman who had seen every trick in the book, was not impressed. She took the two bills and held them up for the Herreras to see, her finger pointing at two specific details on each document. "Take a look at this," she said, her voice a low growl. "Do you see this? It says Malik Mack right here, and it has the date of the visit, February 19th. Her words were a final, decisive blow. There was no need for a doctor's note, no need for a bill to explicitly say dog bite. The bills were for Malik. They were dated the day of the incident. The video had shown the incident. The logic was as simple and unassailable as a mathematical equation. The Herrera's last remaining shred of defense crumbled under the weight of her words. The air in the courtroom grew heavy with the smell of defeat. The tiny dog in Mrs. Herrera's lap whimpered again, a small, pathetic sound that seemed to mirror the emotional state of its owners. Judge Judy looked at the Herreras and then back at Sarah Mack, who sat with a weary yet vindicated expression. She had done everything right. She had raised a respectful son, she had tried to be a good neighbor, and she had tried to handle the aftermath with a quiet, reasonable approach. She had been met with a wall of denial, but she had persevered. The judge's next words sealed the Herrera's fate. Her voice was now a cold, professional tone, the finality of her judgment already palpable. "Now you'll pay the bill because it's an emergency visit on February 19th. You saw the video. That's why she took the child to the emergency room." It was a statement of fact, a declaration that the time for debate was over. The video had been the nail in the coffin, and the bills were the final, irrefutable proof of the harm that had been done. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. The case was closed. All that remained was the final ruling, the words that would bring an end to a case that had begun with a dog bite and ended with a public reckoning. The courtroom, which had been a crucible of human drama for the past hour, fell into a hush. The emotional battle had been won, the facts had been established, and now, with the medical bills laid out on the bench like irrefutable evidence, the only thing left was the final, inevitable judgment. Judge Judy leaned forward one last time, her gaze sweeping from the Herreras, whose faces were now a mask of defeat, to Sarah Mack, who sat with a weary yet vindicated expression. The court was her domain, and she was a master of its intricate language. She spoke not to persuade or to argue, but to declare. Her voice, when it came, was clear and decisive. It cut through the thick air of the courtroom, a final, definitive period at the end of a long, convoluted sentence. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $821. The words were an end and a beginning, an end to the legal battle and a beginning to the messy, unresolved aftermath that would continue long after the gavel fell. Sarah Mack felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the principle, about the simple, human expectation that when you cause harm, you take responsibility for it. She had been forced to fight a battle of denial, and in the end, truth had prevailed. The judge's gavel did not fall. She simply looked at her bailiff, Bird, a silent signal that her work here was done. She leaned back in her chair, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. The case, which had begun with a dog bite and ended with a public reckoning, was over. "We're finished. Thank you." Bird, a towering figure in his uniform, stepped forward, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to fill the room. "Parties are excused. You may step out." And just like that, it was done. The two families who had stood on opposite sides of a courtroom now rose from their chairs, a chasm of bitterness and blame between them. The Herreras, their heads bowed, walked slowly, their tiny, trembling dog a pathetic accessory to their humiliation. Sarah and her two sons rose, a quiet sense of triumph in their posture. But the victory felt hollow, a small comfort in the face of the larger, unresolved conflict. The aftermath, the fluorescent lights of the hallway were a harsh contrast to the somber wood of the courtroom. The two families, separated now by the distance of the hallway, were a study in emotional aftermath. The television cameras and microphones, which had been a silent witness in the courtroom, now sprang to life, their lenses aimed at the Herreras, who had been cornered by a reporter. The Herreras, humiliated by the ruling, were no longer concerned with decorum or civility. Their carefully constructed narrative had been dismantled, and now all that was left was raw, unfiltered bitterness. Frank Herrera, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, spoke first. His voice, when it came, was a tight, controlled snarl. "Malik has been teasing our dog. He does it weekly." The accusation hung in the air, a poisonous barb aimed at a child who was no longer there to defend himself. The reporter, sensing the underlying tension, turned the microphone to Mrs. Herrera, who spoke with a clipped, resentful tone. "My neighbors have actually never told me anything about Malik teasing their dog," Sarah Mack said, having heard the accusation. She watched the scene from a distance, her hand on Malik's shoulder. She knew that Malik, who had always longed for a dog, would never have done something so cruel. The accusation was a slap in the face, a painful continuation of the Herrera's denial. "We've addressed this before in the last 6 months," Mr. Herrera insisted, his voice rising in frustration, "and nothing has been done about it." Sarah shook her head, a tired, weary look on her face. "As far as him teasing them or the dog, I really don't know. Because again, they're kids. I would have stopped it immediately." She knew she would have. If the Herreras had ever come to her, if they had ever spoken to her, she would have put a stop to it. But they hadn't. They had simply watched from afar, allowing a small, insignificant issue to fester and grow into a full-blown crisis. The exchange was a perfect microcosm of the unaddressed feud that had been simmering beneath the surface for 2 years. It was not a courtroom drama, but a neighborly spat that had gone public. There was no mediator here, no Judge Judy to separate truth from lies. There was only raw emotion, bitterness, and blame. "I think it's just poor parenting," Mr. Herrera said, his voice laced with a cold, unforgiving venom. "It's not a parenting issue at all," Sarah shot back, her voice now hard, her patience gone. The accusation was a step too far. It was a direct attack on her and her parenting skills, and she was not going to let it stand. "They need to learn to teach their kids to respect other people's property and animals," Ms. Herrera declared, her voice filled with a self-righteous indignation that seemed to contradict the shame she had so recently felt in the courtroom. The accusations and counter-accusations continued, an endless, cyclical argument that had no end. The court had provided a verdict, but it had not provided a resolution. It had settled a legal dispute, but it had left an emotional one in its wake. The unending conflict. The words of the post-case interviews were a harsh, bitter echo of the courtroom drama. Judge Judy's words, her final judgment, had been an act of legal authority, but they had no power to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. The feud between the two families was not a legal matter. It was a human one, and it was far from over. For Malik, the experience was a mix of triumph and confusion. He had been a small, frightened boy in a terrifying situation, and he had been validated. He had been believed. But the accusations of teasing the dogs confused him. He hadn't been teasing them. He had been playing, and he had been happy to see them. The chase had been a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, but the memory of the small, yapping creatures was now tainted by his neighbor's accusations. For Skylar, the older brother, there was a quiet, lingering guilt. He had told the truth, but his honesty had led to this public humiliation for the Herreras. He had done the right thing, but it hadn't felt right. He had been a witness to a moment of pure chaos, and now he was a witness to a conflict that would likely never end. The parents were the ones who bore the most emotional loss. Sarah Mack felt a grim satisfaction, but it was tempered by the bitter taste of the ongoing conflict. The Herreras, for their part, felt a deep sense of injustice. They had lost the legal battle, but they refused to lose the moral one. They clung to their belief that they were the victims, that a little boy had provoked their dogs, and that they were now paying the price for someone else's irresponsibility. The final image is not of a courtroom, but of two suburban homes, identical in their architecture, separated only by a patch of green grass. There was no fence between the two properties, No physical barrier to separate the two families. But a new wall had been built, a wall of resentment and distrust that was stronger and more permanent than any fence could ever be. It was a wall that had been built one accusation at a time, one act of denial after another, and it was a wall that would likely remain for years to come. The case of the four small dogs was over, but the quiet war between neighbors had just begun.